Today, I'm going to tell you a scary story from the life of an air traffic controller named Alex Grady. You ever get that sinking feeling that something's off, but you can't quite figure out why? That's how it started for me. I'm Alex Grady, an air traffic controller at Black Hollow International Airport, tucked between miles of forest and forgotten farmland. It's not a big airport, mostly regional flights, the occasional international charter, but it's busy enough to keep me glued to my radar screens during the night shift. The first disappearance happened on a rainy Thursday night in October. The kind of night where the rain hammers the control tower windows like impatient fingers. Flight 706, a routine passenger flight from Chicago, was on final approach. Captain Reynolds, a guy I'd spoken to dozens of times before, was steady as ever. Black Hollow Tower, this is Flight 706. On approach. Landing gear down. Visibility's rough, but we're good. I remember replying, Roger, that 706. Runway 22 is clear. Wind steady at 12 knots. You're cleared to land. His acknowledgement came through crystal clear. I watched his little blip on the radar glide in 2 miles out, then 1. Everything was textbook. Then nothing. The blip vanished. Clean. Like someone had wiped it off the screen. I called the tower crew to confirm visuals, but the runway lights stretched out empty beneath the storm. No headlights, no landing gear kicking up spray, just dark, wet tarmac. Flight 706, do you copy? My voice cracked. No response. I tried again. Static. We scrambled search and rescue. For hours, they combed the forests and fields surrounding the airport. But there was no wreckage, no skid marks, no debris. It was like the plane had never existed. They chalked it up to a radar malfunction and filed the crew and passengers as missing. I didn't buy it, but there wasn't a damn thing I could prove. That was just the beginning. A week passed. Everyone tried to move on. But you don't just forget something like that. Not when 138 people vanish into thin air on your watch. I kept replaying that night in my head. Every beep of the radar, every word over the radio, but nothing made sense. Until it happened again. This time it was Flight 882, a cargo run from Boston. Same approach vector, same weather, low clouds, mist hanging thick over the treetops like a damn curtain. I was on shift again. Black Hollow, this is 882, 4 miles out. Everything's looking good. The pilot, Harris, said, his voice easy. Copy that. 882. Runway's clear. Wind's calm. You're cleared to land. I watched the blip close in. For miles. 3, 2. I swear to God. My hands started sweating as the dot blinked at the 1 mile mark. 882. Confirm final approach. I asked, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. Yeah, tower. We're... His voice cut off. The blip disappeared. Gone. Same spot. This time I didn't wait. I hit the emergency beacon. Had ground crews scrambling before the last echo of static faded. Search teams went out again. Nothing. No wreckage. No distress call. Just gone. When I filed the second report, the FAA sent people. Suits. Tight-lipped, cold-eyed types. They took all the flight logs, combed through the radar data, and gave me that official line. Equipment failure. Possible pilot error. Bullshit. 2 planes? Same approach vector? Same point of disappearance? But I didn't push. Not yet. It wasn't until I started digging through old records, stuff buried deep in the airport's archives, that I realized something worse. This had happened before. Flights had gone missing in the 70s. 2 in 92. Private jet in 2004. Always the same. Approaching runway 22, low visibility, final approach. Then gone. But the reports? Buried. Inconclusive. No follow-ups. I felt this cold pit in my stomach. Something was wrong with this airport. Something waiting. After the second disappearance, the tower felt different. The kind of heavy, quiet that makes your ears ring. Like the place itself was holding its breath. Even the other controllers started calling in sick or switching shifts. No one said it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever was happening wasn't some freak glitch. Couldn't let it go. Every night after my shift ended, I stayed late, scrubbing through old flight recordings, radar logs, anything that might give me a thread to pull. The deeper I dug, the more I noticed small, strange things. Minor radar blips in the fog, odd fluctuations in the weather reports right before each disappearance. But the weirdest was the radio static. See, after Flight 882 vanished, I replayed the last transmission over and over. At first, it was just garbled static after Harris cut out. But late one night, I cranked the gain on the recording trying to clean up the noise, just for the hell of it. That's when I heard it. Beneath the static, there was something. A voice. Faint. Warped. Can't see. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. I boosted it more, and the words sharpened. Wrong. Can't break through. The voice wasn't Harris. It was older. Hoarse. Desperate. I traced the timestamp. That message wasn't from Flight 882. It came in 42 seconds after the plane vanished. I sat there, staring at the screen, heart racing, thinking about the missing flights. Were they still somewhere? I didn't sleep that night. The next shift, I didn't even pretend to follow protocol. I patched into the tower's frequency and cycled through every emergency channel, pushing static through the speakers, waiting, hoping to catch something else. For hours, nothing. Just the empty hum of white noise. Then, around 3:14 a.m., the static cracked. Tower. It was a man's voice. Weak. Flight 706, is anyone there? My blood ran cold. Flight 706, this is Black Hollow Tower, I stammered, hands shaking as I mashed the comm button. Captain Reynolds? Is that you? The static swelled, then thinned. Dark, no lights, can't find. Where are you? I yelled. A long beat of silence. Then whispered through the static. We're still in the air. But there's nothing here. Just fog. The transmission cut out. Gone. I sat there frozen, the mic still in my hand. The plane wasn't gone. It was still flying somewhere. But wherever that was, it wasn't our sky anymore. After the transmission, something in me broke. I wasn't just chasing shadows anymore, these people were still out there. Somewhere. I didn't tell my supervisor. I didn't file a report. I knew how it would go, more excuses, more cover-ups. Instead, I pulled the old blueprints of the airport, the ones from back when it was still a military airfield during World War II. Black Hollow had history. That history? In the 40s, it was a testing ground for experimental radar systems. Rumors floated around about dimensional interference, whatever that meant, but the official documents were scrubbed clean. No details, no witnesses left to ask. But there was one thing they couldn't erase. A handwritten note almost lost in the corner of a logbook from 1944. Increased interference over Sector 222. Visibility shifts. Recommend full closure. Sector 222. Runway 222. The same place the planes vanished. The more I dug, the clearer it became whatever was happening wasn't new. It had been there, pulsing beneath this land for decades. And I was starting to think it wasn't natural. I needed answers. So, the next night I did something stupid. I timed it perfectly, waited for the storm system rolling in, low clouds creeping over the tree line. Just like the nights of the disappearances. I filed a fake flight plan. Rented a Cessna from the hangar. I'd been a licensed pilot before I ever sat in the tower, but it had been years since I flew solo. Didn't matter. I wasn't planning on going far. I just needed to see what was waiting out there. By midnight, I was in the air, climbing through the haze, Black Hollow's lights shrinking beneath me. The approach vector to runway 222 cut through thick clouds, visibility barely a few hundred feet. My hands tightened on the yoke as I reached the 1-mile marker, the exact point where the others had disappeared. Black Hollow Tower, this is Cessna 919, I called in, voice shaking. On approach. 1 mile out. No response. Static filled my headset. The air felt heavier. Like I was flying through water instead of clouds. Then my instruments began to flicker. The altimeter spun wildly. The radio crackled, warping into deep, broken tones. And then, the clouds ahead of me thinned, opening into a vast, empty expanse. But it wasn't the airport below me. It wasn't anything. Endless gray stretched in every direction. No ground. No sky. Just a pale, suffocating void. And floating in that nothingness, barely visible through the mist, were the missing planes. I saw them. Flight 706. Flight 882. Motionless. Lights flickering weakly. Like they were stuck between seconds. I felt my own plane lurch, pulled toward them like gravity itself was breaking down. Through the static in my headset, I heard the voice again. You shouldn't be here. The yoke bucked violently. I yanked it hard, fighting the pull, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't know what was in that place or why it wanted them, but I knew if I didn't get out now, I'd be floating right alongside them. With everything I had, I broke through the clouds. When I burst back into real airspace, I was 3 miles off course. The airport glowed safely beneath me like none of it had happened. I landed, barely able to keep the plane steady. When my wheels hit the tarmac, I finally exhaled. But I couldn't shake one thing. Before I lost the signal completely, I heard one last whisper through the static. It's still open. I didn't go home that night. I sat in my car in the airport parking lot, engine off, rain streaking the windshield, trying to process what I'd just seen. The planes weren't gone. They weren't crashed or destroyed. They were trapped somewhere between here and somewhere else. And whatever that somewhere was, it was still hungry. I kept thinking about the voice. It's still open. Open. Like a wound. The next morning, I went back to the archives. I wasn't supposed to be there, but security was loose at Black Hollow, especially for someone with a badge. I dug deeper into the old military files, pulling weather logs, incident reports, anything I could get my hands on. That's when I found it. A decommission report from 1946. It was half-burnt, edges singed, but one section was still readable. Anomaly detected post-radar testing. Atmospheric fractures observed. Disappearances confirmed. Recommend site closure and sealing of affected airspace. Failure to do so may result in further incursions. Atmospheric fractures. They'd known. Since the 40s. And instead of sealing it, they'd paved over it, built a public airport right on top of it. I sat there in the dust-filled archive room, the weight of it all pressing down on me. These planes weren't the first. And if nothing was done, they wouldn't be the last. That night, back in the tower, the storms rolled in again, low clouds, heavy fog. Perfect conditions for another disappearance. I stared at the radar, heart in my throat, waiting. At 11:42 p.m., a blip appeared. Flight 934, a small commercial jet inbound from Toronto. They were on the exact same approach vector. Right toward the fracture. I grabbed the mic. Flight 934, Black Hollow Tower. Immediate course change advised. Veer 20 degrees east. The pilot's voice came back, casual. Tower, we're locked into approach. Weather's rough, but we're good. No, you don't understand, I snapped. Change course now. You're heading into I. The blip on the radar flickered. My stomach dropped. They were seconds from vanishing. I didn't think. I switched the tower's beacon codes, triggering an emergency protocol I wasn't technically authorized to use. The entire approach vector lit up with warning lights, forcing the plane to bank hard. Through the fog, I saw it, a bright curve of lights as Flight 934 veered off. They made it. I collapsed into the chair, sweat slicking my back. But then the radio crackled again. Black Hollow Tower, something's following us, the pilot said, his voice thin with fear. The radar picked up a second blip. It wasn't another plane. It was something else. Something that had slipped through when the fracture opened. And it wasn't planning on going back. The second blip wasn't following standard flight patterns. It didn't hold altitude, didn't match speed regulations, it shifted. Jerky, unpredictable movements like it wasn't bound by the same rules of gravity the rest of us were. Flight 934, divert further east. Now, I barked into the mic, fingers flying over the radar controls, trying to lock onto the anomaly. Tower, it's right above us, the pilot shot back, voice tight with panic. I squinted out the tower's rain-streaked windows, but all I could see was the thick wall of clouds. Then a flash of lightning split the sky, and for a single, breathless second, I saw it. It wasn't a plane. It was enormous. Silent. A shifting mass of jagged metal and something that almost looked like bone, hovering without wings, its surface rippling like heat off asphalt. It didn't move like it was flying. It moved like it was slipping through space itself. And it was hunting. 934, descend to 2,000 feet and get the hell out of there. The blip representing the plane dipped sharply on the radar, but the anomaly followed, matching its moves perfectly. My hands shook as I cycled through emergency protocols. I had one last option, the old military frequencies still embedded in the tower's systems. Maybe, just maybe, the original engineers had something built in to fight this. I flipped the switch. A low hum filled the room, followed by a deep, resonant pulse that shook the glass in its frame. Outside, the clouds above the airport twisted, spiraling downward like a massive whirlpool in the sky. The anomaly jerked violently on the radar, its path spasming. Tower. It's retreating, the pilot shouted. I watched as the second blip distorted, like the radar couldn't fully process its shape before it snapped backward, vanishing completely. The sky went dead quiet. Flight 934, confirm status, I called, my throat dry. We're clear, the pilot breathed. Jesus, what the hell was that? I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. But I did know something else. That fracture in the airspace? It wasn't just a rift. It was a door. And tonight, something had tried to come through. The days after Flight 934's near miss were the quietest I'd ever seen Black Hollow. No departures. No arrivals. FAA shut the place down for investigation, but we all knew the truth. Something had pushed through that fracture, and it wasn't done. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing again, hovering above the clouds, its twisted form rippling against the lightning. But worse than that, I kept hearing the voices. They bled through the static on my car radio. Through my TV even when it was unplugged. We're still here. It's open. Help us. It was the missing pilots. The ones still trapped. Somewhere between here and wherever that fracture led. I had to go back. Not in the air this time. I couldn't risk another close encounter with whatever the hell was floating out there. No, this time I was going to the source, runway 222. It was just past midnight when I snuck onto the tarmac. The storm clouds had thinned, leaving a heavy mist clinging low over the ground. The runway stretched out in front of me, dark, empty, silent. I walked along the edge, the gravel crunching under my boots, the red and white lights blinking in a slow, almost hypnotic rhythm. Then I felt it. A low vibration beneath my feet. It wasn't a plane. It was coming from beneath the runway. I followed it to the far end where the old access tunnels from the military days still snaked underground. Most had been sealed decades ago, but I found a rusted maintenance hatch, its bolts corroded and weak. It took everything I had to wrench it open. The smell hit me first, damp earth, rusted metal, and something chemical. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls lined with ancient cables and forgotten equipment. My flashlight flickered, its beam cutting through the thick dust hanging in the air. As I moved deeper, the air grew colder. And then I saw it. A chamber, massive, circular, its walls lined with strange metal plates, each covered in geometric etchings that shimmered faintly in the dark. At the center was a towering structure, an old radar array, twisted and warped like it had been partially melted. But it was still active, pulsing. I realized then this wasn't a natural fracture. The military had made it. They'd torn a hole through something they didn't understand. And it had never fully closed. That's when the static started again, filling the chamber. Louder this time. And beneath it, voices. Hundreds of them. Help us, help us. Then another sound. Something dragging across the concrete. I wasn't alone down here. The dragging sound grew louder, metal scraping against concrete, slow and deliberate. My flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering as the temperature in the chamber dropped, my breath clouding in front of me. I spun the light toward the noise. At first, I didn't see it, just shadows stretching along the curved walls, distorted by the flickering beam. But then something moved. A figure. It limped into the edge of the light, its form twisted, parts of a pilot's uniform still clinging to its broken frame. The visor of its helmet was cracked, revealing a pale, sunken face beneath. But the worst part? I recognized him. It was Captain Reynolds, Flight 706. See, Captain? My voice cracked in the freezing air. His head jerked toward me, the movement sharp, unnatural. Still here, his voice was hollow, like it was being funneled through miles of static. Where have you been? I whispered, my hands trembling around the flashlight. He staggered forward, and I saw more of them now, half a dozen figures emerging from the shadows, all in tattered uniforms, faces hollowed by time spent elsewhere. Between, Reynolds rasped. No ground. No sky. Just the pull. He reached out, and for a split second I felt it too, this gut-wrenching sense of weightlessness, like my body was on the verge of being yanked out of existence. The fracture wasn't just a tear. It was a snare. It's widening, he hissed. You opened it more. I was trying to save you, I stammered. His cracked helmet tilted. Too late. It's hungry now. The chamber vibrated beneath my feet, the radar array pulsing violently. Cracks formed in the walls, thin lines of blinding white light bleeding through. Something was trying to push through. Help me close it. I yelled. But Reynolds only shook his head, his form already starting to unravel, strips of his body dissolving into static like he wasn't fully anchored here. Can't. It's awake now. The walls buckled, and from behind the radar array, a black tendril burst through the crack, thin at first, then thickening, writhing, clawing its way into the chamber. It wasn't a storm, or a void, or some strange natural phenomenon. It was alive. I bolted. Raced back up the tunnel as the entire underground complex shuddered, metal beams groaning, the walls splitting wider. Behind me, I heard Reynolds' voice one last time, echoing through the collapsing space. It won't stop now. I barely made it through the maintenance hatch before the ground gave way, the tarmac above splitting open as if the earth itself was tearing at the seams. When I looked back, the end of runway 222 was gone, swallowed by a sinkhole that oozed that same pale fog. The fracture wasn't just open anymore. It was growing. They closed Black Hollow the next morning. Officially, it was an infrastructure failure, some nonsense about a sinkhole caused by old military tunnels collapsing. But the sinkhole was still there, churning with that fog, the cracks spidering out across the tarmac like veins. I didn't go home. I sat in the tower watching the monitors go dead one by one. Every radar sweep glitched now, wild arcs of static cutting across the screens. But there was one signal still coming through. A blip. Faint. It hovered out beyond the approach vector, exactly where the other planes had disappeared. I tuned the radio, pushing past the static, my fingers shaking. Flight 706, do you copy? Dead air. Then, tower. It was Reynolds. We can see lights. Is that the runway? But there was no runway. Not anymore. They were still out there, still circling, trapped in that in-between space, caught in a loop where they thought they were still on approach. Captain, listen to me, I said, voice low. There's no safe landing. You need to pull up. Break off the pattern. Static. We've been flying for so long, fuel's low. Reynolds, if you descend, you're not coming back. You'll fall deeper into that, whatever the hell that void is. I could almost feel him hesitating. I can't hold it. The blip on the radar dipped, the plane banking downward. Panic surged through me. Then, a second blip appeared. Closer. Moving fast. It wasn't Reynolds. It was the other thing. The anomaly. It was hunting them again. Reynolds. Pull up. Now. It's behind us. The radar burst into static. I slammed my fist into the console, the glass cracking under the impact. But then, the anomaly's blip didn't disappear. It was still there. And it was moving toward the airport. Toward me. I stood there, paralyzed, watching as the blip closed the distance. No clouds to hide it this time. Out over the tree line, the air twisted, folding in on itself. And then, through the mist, I saw it, low, massive, its surface flickering with that same sickly, bone metal sheen. It wasn't trying to stay hidden anymore. It was coming through. The fracture was no longer a crack in the sky. It was a doorway. And now it was wide open. The tower windows vibrated under a deep, guttural hum, the kind you don't hear so much as feel in your bones. Out beyond the cracked runway, the air folded inward, the clouds spiraling like something enormous was forcing its way through. The anomaly was fully emerging. No flickers. No static. It was here. I could see it now, its surface glistening, a grotesque blend of rusted metal and something organic, veins of pulsing light running along its hull. It had no wings, no engines, just this vast, floating mass, its edges constantly shifting like reality itself couldn't decide what shape it should take. And beneath it, something worse. The sinkhole at the end of runway 222 had widened, its edges crumbling into an abyssal pit, fog vomiting upward in thick streams. Shapes were moving in it. Long, spindly things, reaching up like fingers from whatever was beneath. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have time for one. But I knew this, if that thing fully broke through, it wasn't going to stop at Black Hollow. It would keep spreading. The radar array. The pulse that had driven it back before, it was still wired into the tower's control system. Maybe if I could overload it. I scrambled to the console, bypassing the fried circuits, fingers flying over the controls. The system groaned in protest, warning lights flaring red, but I forced the power grid to spike. Outside, the array at the edge of the runway, twisted and rusted, began to glow. The anomaly shifted, its entire mass rotating toward me. It knew. The radar screens exploded into static as the air outside thickened, warping around the tower. Shards of glass cracked inward as the pressure mounted. Come on, I muttered, rerouting the final power conduit. The array screamed to life. A single, bone-deep pulse shot through the ground, the air, the everything. The anomaly convulsed. Its surface rippled, cracking along its seams as the pulse tore through it. The fog recoiled, sucked back toward the sinkhole, dragging those spindly shapes with it. But the tower wasn't built for this kind of power. The ground beneath me trembled. I had seconds. I grabbed the emergency transmitter and keyed it to the tower's wideband frequency. To anyone listening, this is Black Hollow Tower. The fracture is closing. But if you see the clouds spiral, if the sky folds, you run. You run. The static swallowed my words as the tower split beneath me. The last thing I saw was the anomaly tearing itself apart, light bleeding from its ruptured core as it was dragged, screaming, back through the fracture. Then, white. I woke up in the woods, miles from the airport. Don't ask me how. I shouldn't have survived. Black Hollow is gone now. The crater where the airport once stood is sealed off, fenced, and guarded. No official reports. No media coverage. But sometimes on heavy storm nights, pilots still report strange blips on their radars. Phantom signals. Voices in the static. And every once in a while, I'll be driving late at night, flicking through radio stations, and I'll catch it just for a second. Black Hollow Tower requesting clearance to land. Like they're still out there. Circling. Waiting.